For example, this offshore trust that was set up in the early 2000s, this was the in the Isle of Man, wasn't it? The Farage Family Educational Trust.
We should pause to say that, OK, he admitted it was a mistake, but it was a step which is possibly the most aggressive piece of tax planning I've seen from a politician in the UK.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston.
And me, Steph McGovern.
Now, we're delighted again to be joined by Dan Neidle, our house-trained tax expert.
Barely house-trained.
One of our absolute favourite guests. And we had you on very recently, but we really wanted you back this week because there has been so much focus on the tax affairs of our leading politicians. It was only a few days ago that the then Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was forced to resign because the ethics advisor discovered that she hadn't taken advice from her legal advisors to get specialist tax advice on what rate of stamp duty she should pay. That has then created an awful lot of interest in the tax affairs of our other leaders, and in particular, the tax affairs of Nigel Farage, who obviously very critical of this government, very critical of Angela Rayner. The leaders of our parties have in recent years sort of got into the habit of publishing their tax returns. Keir Starmer has, Rishi Sunak did before the last election when he was Prime Minister.
Except they didn't.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that. I think there is a big issue around what they published and whether it is genuinely what we need to know. And I want to come back to that. But I thought we should start with Farage. He has not committed to publish anything additional from what he files at Companies House and what he puts in the members' register of the House of Commons. You've had a look at what he files at Companies House. And really what we wanted to start this discussion looking at was, what do you think we can glean about Nigel Farage's personal finances from what he's filed at Companies House and what he's filed in Parliament?
Sure. And of course, none of that is going to tell us anything about his arrangements for buying a house with his partner, because individuals don't file accounts. All we can see are the companies.
Totally right. And actually, I suppose if you want to, since there has been a lot of focus, headlines in the Daily Mirror about the fact that his house in Clacton was bought by his partner. He didn't pay the stamp duty. She paid the stamp duty. She presumably paid the lower rate of stamp duty. The Daily Mirror is calling him a hypocrite for attacking Angela Rayner, accusing him of somehow paying fast and loose. I actually asked him about this when I interviewed him the other day, and he just said it was rubbish, this attack on him. But what do you think?
So I'll do the boring lawyer thing and say it depends on exactly what happens. It depends on the facts. So let's think about the different possibilities. The whole thing blew up because in the autumn of last year, Farage was asked why he doesn't spend time in his constituency, and he said that he used the word I, had just exchanged on a house. When it turned out, I think in May this year, that it had been his partner who had actually made the purchase. It's her name on the property. At which point, the Mirror is jumped to the conclusion, aha, this shows that he avoided tax. Because if he had bought a house, he owns property already, there would have been higher rate stamp duty, it's another 5%. But the fact she bought meant there wasn't, saving them about £44,000. So that's the basic attack. But whether this is tax avoidance really depends on what happened. Let's think about several scenarios. One scenario is that she bought it herself from her own resources. Yeah, it was a joint decision to buy in Clacton, as most partners do with financial decisions. They discuss them. He wanted to move to Clacton. She wanted a house. She had the resources. She bought it. In that case, it's not tax avoidance at all. It's simply her buying a house. Now, if they've been married couples only get one house between them in this stupid and rather paternalistic set of rules we have to deal with. So if I already own a house and my wife buys one, higher rate applies. Because they're not married, they each get a house without higher rate. And her deciding to buy a house doesn't trigger higher rate, not avoidance. Now, some people have said, aha, but she was just a waitress, they say rather patronisingly. How could she afford a £900,000 house? And he's made some remarks suggesting her family is wealthy. We've actually looked into that, and I don't want to really go into the detail because I don't think it's fair to a private individual to delve much more other than to say that there is some evidence that her family is indeed at least reasonably wealthy. So it's not implausible she could afford that house.
You also want to make sure you've got a house of your own in case you split up too, and you don't have that whole complication of trying to divide everything. So in a way, that makes total economic sense for you to do that. But obviously, there's a lot of speculation about the real reason for it.
You need to have a home in Clacton. You're a 40-something person of means who doesn't currently own property. It's by no means crazy to then decide that you want to buy the Clacton property. So this does not seem implausible to me. Now, we then get into scenarios where Mr. Farage is lying, because he said very clearly that he didn't give her the money, he didn't loan her the money. If he is lying and he gave her the money, then people might well regard that as tax avoidance. Depending on how he did it, it might be failed avoidance. You could actually end up with the higher rate charge anyway. But we shouldn't really accuse people of lying on the basis of no evidence. And there's really no reason to think that he's lying, other than the fact that he initially said, I'd exchange, but I see that as just a sort of convenient political slip, perhaps slightly naughty of him at the time. Implying that means he's lying now, I think is a little bit stretching it.
So what about, though, if we look at other things that Nigel Farage has done in the past in terms of what looks like tax avoidance? You can tell us whether it is or it isn't. But for example, this offshore trust that was set up in the early 2000s, this was in the Isle of Man, wasn't it? The Farage Family Educational Trust.
So this is a company called Farage Limited, which I think was a family investment company. Nigel Farage's brother, Andrew, had half the shares when the company was founded in 2003. The other half were not held by Nigel Farage. They were held by this trust. And it continued holding it all the way through to 2011 when it gave the shares to Andrew. The company then collapsed rather disastrously with something like £100,000 owed to HMRC. Andrew Farage was found to have received an unlawful dividend. Don't really know how that resolved, but a huge mess. So it comes back to, why did Nigel Farage hold it through an Isle of Man trust? And that is unusual structuring. I mean, I'm not some shrinking naive. I was a tax lawyer in the city for 25 years. I've seen all kinds of structures. But for a UK individual to set up an Isle of Man trust is unusual. It's absolutely tax avoidance. It's also quite aggressive tax avoidance. It's not entirely clear why someone would have done that. Possibly it was a capital gains play. Possibly he was planning to maybe leave the country at some point and take a capital gain if the company was successful. We can't know, but we should pause to say that, okay, he admitted it was a mistake, but it was a step which is possibly the most aggressive piece of tax planning I've seen from a politician in the UK.
What do we glean from that in respect of Nigel Farage's attitude to tax?
So lots of people have different attitudes to tax, and I mean, most people will do something that saves them a bit of tax, but won't do anything very complicated, not least because they can't afford to. On the other hand, the very largest companies tend these days, at any rate, to have an extremely cautious attitude to tax and don't want to do anything that creates risk. So the people at the edge tend to be small business people. They regard it more as their money. They don't have risk committees to hold them back. And even now, they will still do things that are quite aggressive. And I think we should see Mr. Farage through that lens. And that perhaps explains why he set up a rather dodgy looking trust in the early 2000s. Would he do the same now that he's not primarily a businessman, that he has an obvious political profile? Perhaps not, but that's just speculation. But the point must be right, that we need to be a little bit more sceptical than would be, say, of Keir Starmer's tax affairs, simply because of this history.
So we've moved on from the offshore trust. Where are we going next with Nigel Farage's interesting money-making and tax paying?
We're going to gin.
We're going to Brexit gin, which is a gripping episode. Tell us about whether Brexit gin was a money spinner.
So for anyone who unaccountably missed the news in 2022, Nigel Farage launched some gin, which he said was, well, it was called Farage Gin. It was the, got to do scare quotes, taste of Brexit. It came in 3 colours, red gin, white gin and blue gin.
Yeah, of course.
He was going to send a bottle to his apparent friend Jean-Claude Juncker and to Donald Trump, who doesn't drink, there was a launch, and these were actual bottles actually sold. And one of our team saw a photo of one, and there was something interesting about it. Because in this photo was the name of a company, the company that makes the gin. That company was called Baxter Lawis Limited. Lawis spelt Laois. And this is a company owned by Mr. Farage's partner that she set up in 2015 as a consultancy company, which seems to have had very little going on, just a few £1,000s, then kind of did nothing for a few years before 2022. And then in 2022, clearly it took over this gin business. It seems to have lost about £16,000. And then that's it. And then in August, his partner applied to strike the company off from Companies House, but then changed her mind about a month later. If this company was the company behind the gin, which the label suggests, then the gin was not a successful venture and not a large venture.
So it didn't do very well then. I mean, how many bottles are we talking that they sold?
So there's this game we have to play with small companies where you ask me a question about them and I say, I don't know, because the way small companies are currently allowed to account, there's very little detail public. We can see their balance sheet. We can sometimes infer what their annual profit was. We can't be certain about it. We don't know the turnover. So that 16,000 loss, did they sell 1 million bottles but lose money? Did they sell no bottles at all and lose money? Dunno. All we can say is they lost about £16,000.
So where do the Farage related accounts go from there?
So then we get to the main course of this, which is Thorn in the Side Limited. This is the company that Mr. Farage's media income goes through. So now we're talking about quite serious money. There was a little fuss a couple of weeks ago that Farage was avoiding tax because when he's paid by GB News for the show he does with him, which I think is about £400,000 last year, they don't pay him individually, they pay to this company. And quite a lot of people went, aha, he's avoiding tax. But it's not quite so simple. We can get to that in a bit. We can look at the company and we can have an idea of how it's doing. And these are kind of estimates because it's a small company. It doesn't give us much disclosure. But we can see that the company made profits of about £350,000 in 2023 and about 1.6 million in 2024.
Wow.
So by the standards of a UK politician, Nigel Farage is a very wealthy man.
If you look at his filings to Parliament, the Register of Interests, he does have a very significant stream of commercial earnings. And actually, it's worth just making a contrast here. If you look at, for example, Kemi Badenoch's filings, she has very substantial political donations registered, but zero, absolutely, she has literally zero commercial earnings. Whereas Nigel Farage has, you mentioned GB News, where he is, regularly filing 30,000, 40,000 in monthly income from GB News for his television program. So he's a brand ambassador, for example, for a bullion, a gold broker called Direct Bullion. And so, for example, for 4 hours work, he received the money anyway on the 6th of January 2025. For 4 hours work from Direct Bullion, he got £91,200. And this is for doing sort of online promos for this bullion business. As I understand it, they think he helps sort of somehow bolster their image or bolster the image of buying gold. There is a sort of tax angle here as well, because if apparently you buy what are called Britannia coins or gold coins created by our Royal Mint, there is no capital gains tax to pay or indeed VAT to pay if you buy your gold in that form. And I think, as I understand it, this firm does sell gold in that form.
Yeah, and Robert, you mentioned that 91 grand he got in January 2025. Only a month before that, he got double that. He got 189 grand from them in December 2024. So this is a lot of money.
How many hours work was the 189,000?
I think it's 4 hours per month.
That's quite an hourly rate.
It is. It's also a product that I would suggest people should steer clear of. So I'm a tax lawyer. I was always talking to people about tax. But one thing pretty much all tax advisors will tell you is don't do something just because of tax, because then you can end up making a decision which looks great from a tax perspective, but is bad from another perspective. And gold bullion is a classic example of that people see the gold price go up. They think, aha, here's a way to invest in gold and not pay capital gains tax. Yeah, but you're not investing in the kind of gold that's easy to trade. You're investing in coins there isn't a liquid market, and you may well find that even if the price of gold goes up, you can't realize that. So the gain that you're trying to get tax-free may end up not being a gain at all. So I would suggest people think very carefully before being led by the apparent tax benefit on this.
Can I ask about the way he uses this thorn in the side for his media appearances? Because that's quite common. There are lots of people who do that, who put their income from media stuff and corporate work and things like that, freelancers, through a private company. And then, this means you're paying the 25% tax and not the 45% personal income tax. And that's not illegal. You can do that. Loads of people do that. But where there's a problem is with something like GB News, where, we understand he gets about 400 grand a year from there. There is the IR35 potential issue here, isn't there? Which is this tax legislation to stop what's known as disguised employment. So where you're paying less tax and national insurance because you've been paid through a private company. And there's been loads of really high profile disputes around this, haven't there? Like Lorraine had this dispute with the courts and said when she does Lorraine, she's playing the part of Lorraine and she isn't actually Lorraine, so therefore those rules don't stand. I love that. But is there a chance that might be where he's avoiding tax there through if you look at something like GB News?
So there's several levels to this. Let's start with me as an example. So the £1,000 fee that you're not paying me for this but might, let's say you pay me £1,000 for this. If you pay that to me personally, I'm going to be taxed to that. And if I'm a top rate taxpayer, I'll be paying 45% tax on that. What if alternatively, I set up a company and you pay my company? Well, the company will pay corporation tax at 25%. I say, aha, well, that's a great deal. You're paying 25% instead of 45%. But hang on, the company's got the money. If I want the money, I have to get it out of the company. And if the company pays me a dividend, when I receive the dividend, I'm going to be taxed at 39.35%. So I end up with an overall higher level of tax than if I just received the money directly. So in that scenario, I lose out by using a company. But I'm going to say but a lot of times. But I don't have to pay the money out to me. What if I use the money to make investments? That's pretty good then, because eventually, I may take a dividend from the company years away, but for now, I'm saving tax. And saving tax now is a pretty good result. So even in that simple case, I might get a tax benefit by using a company. Is that tax avoidance? Everyone can decide, but it's perfectly legal, as they say, and there's no rules that stop it.
And is that Farage's thorn in the side? I mean, it may be that this is not visible from the fairly basic accounts they file, but is there any sign that Farage's thorn in the side is using the cash that comes in to make investments that stay within thorn in the side?
So it looks like of the significant amounts the company's made in the last few years, about £350,000 have paid out in dividends in 2023. Most of the rest was used to buy an investment property worth about £1.25 million. We don't know what that is, but I'm guessing some kind of real estate somewhere in the world. So the simple case is where you guys pay me and I put it through a company, and that's fine. But let's imagine that we do this podcast every week and you pay me £1,000 every time. At that point, HMRC might well say, hang on, you're really an employee. You're avoiding tax here. And to decide whether I'm an employee, they'd look at things like, does it have to be me turning up? Could I get someone else to go instead of me? Do I decide the hours or do you decide the hours? Who decides kind of what I'm saying, what we're covering? Is that me or is that you? And there's a bunch of rules that say whether these rules could IR35 would apply. If they do apply, then even though the money is paid to a company, it's taxed as if I was an employee. And here's the kicker. It's not me that gets to make that decision. It's you when you hire me. So if you get it wrong, you're going to have a bad time with HMRC. If you prudently decide to apply our IR35, then I get less money, but your life is easier. So most businesses will apply these rules quite cautiously. And I think there are signs that that's happening with GB News and Farage, that they are actually applying IR35. And even though the money is going to a company, they're paying him as if he's an employee. And there's signs of that in the accounts.
And what are those signs?
So those signs are that we can look at how much money is coming in broadly. We can look at how much tax it pays, corporation tax. And there's a lack of corporation tax of about £350,000 in 2023. And yeah, that lack could be some evil tax avoidance scheme. But I think probably more likely it's because that's the money he got paid by GB News that year, and it's paid under IR35, so he's taxed personally on it, and the company doesn't pay tax on it. So this is an educated guess, but and I'm not an IR35 specialist, but I've spoken to people who are, and they think that if GB News behaved like a normal, prudent business, this is what they'd do.
So that's not avoidance.
And that would be the exact opposite of avoidance. Having the company is doing nothing in that scenario.
These things are slightly gripping. I mean, maybe in a slightly voyeuristic sense, I admit. But, looking at the members' register relating to him, it is astonishing how much money he makes from doing these little personal messages for Cameo. Notoriously, Nigel Farage on one occasion shouted up the rah to somebody in Ireland who had requested a message from him, apparently not realizing he was supporting the IRA by saying this. But anyway, so for example, again, on January the 7th of this year, he gets 27,000 quid for a month's, for 28 hours work recording these messages for Cameo. And I mean, the payments from Cameo are extraordinary. 9,000, 9,000, 17,000, 17,000, 27,000, 15,000. 9,000, 12,000. These are just in the months since he's become an MP. This is a sort of amazing, isn't it, that people are prepared to pay so much money for a personal message from Farage?
But it shows his popularity, doesn't it? That's the thing here. This is members of the public paying to get messages from him, likely people who would then go and vote for him.
I mean, I won't disclose who. But there is no. I'm sitting next to a very, very, very well-known national treasure actor a couple of days ago, and I was slightly intrigued that this person volunteered how much they loved Farage. As I say, I'm not going to embarrass this person by revealing a private conversation, but there's no question that Farage reaches extraordinary numbers of people, and right now, partly I think because of just massive disillusionment with Labour and Tories, the number of people who say to me, "Oh, of course they're a bit flaky, Reform, but I hate the others so much. I'm going to risk everything being broken. That's why I'm backing them."
So coming back to Dan to the tax affairs then, and the kind of the question here about, we know Nigel Farage doesn't publish personal tax returns. Should he? I mean, should we know what's going on? Does it matter if there's avoidance being used?
It looks as though he's earning, I don't know, £800,000-900,000 a year. And if he were paying 45% tax, if that was pure income, then, he ought to be paying somewhere between £300,000 and £400,000 to the taxman a year. If he isn't, because he's, channeling stuff through companies and finding ways to get his tax bill down, should we care about that? Is that something is that something voters should be critical of and worry about?
I mean, it's a really good question. So let's park the GB News thing, where there's a question as to exactly how it's treated. Let's look at, say, his speaker fees. He is 100% within his rights to put them through a company. There is no rule stopping that. As a tax lawyer, I would say it is not tax avoidance because Parliament clearly anticipates it and is cool with it. I suspect quite a lot of normal people who aren't tax lawyers, or normal people as they're called, would disagree and say that in choosing to do it this way and pay less tax, he is avoiding tax. That's a pure political question. I can't cast much light on it.
I think the thing for me is whether we expect our politicians to be different from other people. Do we have different standards for them? Because as we're saying, it's not illegal. So therefore, why can't they use the loopholes that other people do? And yeah, okay, there's a sense of they shouldn't, because there's lots of people who couldn't afford to get the advice to be able to do it. But I think kind of vilifying them for it is wrong. If it's illegal, yeah. I think offshore stuff is different as well, because that feels particularly, as Dan said right at the start, aggressive. But if it's just the kind of general thing that lots of people are doing, I don't think that to me feels like a massive deal.
So look, plainly anything that breaks the rules, certainly anything that's illegal at that point, you should be toast as a politician. I think I would argue politicians should absolutely not engage in aggressive tax avoidance schemes, because I think if you are going into public life, you are basically saying that it's really important that public services, you might have a disagreement about what public services are provided, but you can't have a disagreement that our public services should be funded properly. I think if you're going out of your way to withhold essentially what most people would regard as legitimate funding from sort of schools and hospitals, I just think politicians shouldn't be doing that. In my own life, I've always taken a pretty straightforwardly, some people will, I think, accuse me of being a bit self-righteous about this. I have never engaged in aggressive tax planning, or indeed almost any tax planning at all, because of a sort of, I suppose the way I was brought up. And it's partly because I think if you're doing our job, you and me, Steph, and we're holding people to account, you don't want people to accuse you of playing fast and loose with the rules if you are to an extent, judging other people, which of course we inevitably do. And I slightly think the standards to which you and I hold ourselves are the standards to which most politicians should hold themselves, and that's to do with ethics. It's also to do with competence.
I agree with you, because every year in the however many years I've been, when I left my BBC staff contract and then went freelance, every year my accountant said you really should set up a private company. It's much more tax efficient, and I was like, I don't want to. I'm gonna, and I know we both sound self-righteous here, but I do think it comes back to how we are talking about money, and we are putting people under scrutiny about their own tax affairs, for us then to be, avoiding tax or whatever, or being more tax efficient, as the accountant always pitched it to me every year. I just think, yeah, you're right. But we are not. But equally, I say all this, but I still think, I don't know if that's the same for politicians. Politicians, in the main, don't earn like absolutely masses of money for the scrutiny and the public profile that they end up having because of it. So I don't. It's a really tricky one. I think I'm on the fence with it, to be honest. I'm really pathetically on the fence.
Most of them don't have the ability or the opportunity to avoid tax because they don't earn anything. They have their MP's salary, they have a small amount of outside earnings, and that's it. So it's really only a small percentage, where it's even a live question.
Dan, there's so much more we need to talk to you about, but we're just going to go for a quick break.
Can we talk about some of the other politicians whose taxes get published? Or as you, Dan, shouted in as Robert was doing the introduction to this about, well, no, they don't. No, this is different. So should we look at Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak then and tell us your thoughts on that?
So every year, with great fanfare, the party leaders release their tax returns and the press covers them, and it's all about their tax returns this, their tax returns that. No, they're not publishing their tax returns. No politician has ever published their tax returns. Instead, we get this boulderized summary, normally signed by some accountant, which says what they want to tell us, and that's it. It's not a tax return. So please, 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 every journalist listening to this, please stop saying they're publishing their tax returns, because they're not. They're publishing a summary of what they want to publish, and that's it.
And so what you think we should see instead is the actual filled out form, the little squared boxes where the numbers are put in, not this neat front page, which is, with headed paper to legitimise it from the accountant or whatever. You're saying we should see the actual thing that goes to HMRC.
I have two very slightly contradictory views on this. My first view is that we should not be demanding layers of detail on their personal affairs from our politicians. Politics is kind of crap. I mean, I think anyone who goes into it is mad, but we need people to do it. And everything that we put in the way of good people doing it, people who are professionally successful, people with resources doing it, is going to deter those people. So I am hesitant about the whole publishing tax return thing. I'm particularly hesitant because I'm not sure it tells us what people think it does. So let's imagine that someone has done something dodgy. They're certainly not going to see it in those one-page tax summaries. You may well not even see it in their tax return. If it's really dodgy, something like what Zahawi was up to, not in his tax return. Or indeed Mr. Farage's offshore trust wouldn't have been in his tax return. So I'm sceptical about the advantage of doing it, and I'm concerned about the cost of doing it. That said, if you're going to do it properly. That's my contradictory positions.
Have we got, in your view, the right kind of regime when it comes to the transparency, the financial? Because look, what is the point of transparency? The point of transparency is to prevent our politicians, or at least to make them think twice about lining their own pockets in ways they really oughtn't to be doing as a result of being in public life. And, there's just all through history, we know that despite the fact we might argue the quality of some of our politicians may have fallen, but all through history, people who've got into politics for the wrong reasons. There've been bad ones all through the history of politics, and there've been plenty of examples of people lining their own pockets as a result of the unfair advantages that they glean of going into public life. And so, in general, I take the view that there has to be some transparency about their affairs.
I think I'd draw a distinction between transparency on their affairs when they're in politics, which is necessary and right, and their tax returns, which refer to their personal affairs, much of which will predate their time in politics or have nothing to do with their activity in politics. So for me, the two are different. I certainly agree that the transparency is insufficient. I'm about to go on another extended rant. So my dear friend, Mr. Zahawi, his money was largely made by property investments. These property investments were funded by a loan of over £100 million. Who from? We don't know. If an MP gets a loan on favourable terms from someone, they have to disclose it. But if the MP gets the loan into a company that they hold, even if they're the only owner of that company, they don't have to disclose it. And I had a bizarre amount of correspondence with the Parliamentary Standards Ombudsman on this, where they said, well, it's not theirs, it's their company's. I said, come on, if I own a company, the stuff in that company is me. It can't be right that an MP doesn't have to disclose loans or even gifts to companies they control. But right now, they don't.
There is a sort of grey area which has been bothering me for some time, and it actually did come up in a sort of case I was investigating with a leading politician not that long ago, which is that although the rules say that if you get preferential treatment from a mate who sort of lends you money on incredibly advantageous terms, that you would have to disclose under the ministerial code and under the rules for what you disclose to Parliament in the Register of Interests. But you don't have to disclose a commercial loan that you receive. And as we all know, that is a sort of judgment issue. It is not beyond the capability of a creative mind to take a loan on terms that they're going to pretend are sort of normal and commercial, but obviously aren't. And proving that they have broken the rules is very hard.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty you'll have is you don't want every bank loan to a politician to be disclosed. So where exactly you're going to draw the line?
Why?
Is it fair for MPs' mortgages to be disclosed? Short-term loans, credit card spending?
Yeah, if they're deciding the policy on all ours, then why not?
To me, that's a step too far. It becomes an intrusion into personal life, which makes politics even more unattractive.
Yeah, I know that's the thing. All of this stuff puts you off being a politician.
And obviously, we don't want good people, to be put off, as we've been saying. But I have to say, there are definitely examples in history of, our politicians getting into trouble and being bailed out by a mate. And that does happen. And that gives the mate incredible leverage over that individual. And in those circumstances, we, the public, have a right to know, because, if you're in hock to an individual, you are basically under their influence.
So just on Angela Rayner then, and, her leaving a job because of the stamp duty carry on. What I don't understand is, why couldn't she just ring HMRC? Why couldn't someone in her position just find out exactly what is right and wrong when it comes to it?
The boring answer is that HMRC is a non-ministerial department, precisely so that politicians can't use it for favours on the one hand or sick it on their political enemies on the other hand. But that has not always been observed. So in 2025, I think there would have been outrage if she'd done that. In 1925, Winston Churchill went way further than that. He always earned a lot of money, but he spent a lot of money. Never a good idea. In those days, an even worse idea, because the top tax rate was over 90%. So if you earned a lot of money and spent it and then got the tax bill, you were in a pickle. And he did that again and again and again. And in 1925, the situation was so bad that he called up the head of HMRC and met with him and said, I need help. I need to find a way to avoid tax. And the head of HMRC devised a tax avoidance scheme for Churchill, which involved Churchill retiring and then his earnings in his final year weren't taxed. And there are documents on this, which a very kind man has pulled out from Kew, and hopefully I'll be publishing soon, because I'm fascinated by all things tax and fascinated by all things Churchill. So both of them together in one place is just irresistible. But they devised this scheme. Churchill retired from writing, got a bunch tax-free. Then it happened again. A few years later, it happened again after the war. And each time he called in favours. In fact, it happened during the war. How could I have forgotten this? So during the war, HMRC said, well, that's enough pretending to retire, Mr. Churchill. We're going to tax you this time. And he took it to an appeal, and Churchill won that appeal. This was a kind of private appeal within HMRC. But HMRC, or Inland Revenue as it was then, appealed that to a public tribunal. This is during the darkest days of World War II, at which point someone saw sense and instructed HMRC to back off. And they did back off. So there's a whole history of Winston Churchill's not at all arm's length dealings with HMRC, which no politician today can or should replicate. And plug for the Tax Policy Associates website, which as soon as I get off my arse is going to have some material on this.
Fascinating.
Now, we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. What are your final thoughts, Dan?
I'm not very keen on peering into the details of politicians' private lives, let alone those of their spouses and partners. But sometimes we can learn something from the tax return. So Rishi Sunak's tax return was noteworthy to many people because it showed that capital gains, which he received from his investments, were taxed at half the rate of tax on income. Now, to me, a tax lawyer, yes, so what, totally unsurprising, not tax avoidance. But to many people not steeped in this, that is surprising, indeed alarming. Similarly with Mr. Farage, if we saw his tax return, I suspect many people would think it's extremely strange that you can half your tax by putting a company to receive your income. And we shouldn't be revealing this to personally attack Mrs. Sunak or Farage because they're just applying the rules. But it helps get a focus on whether we think the rules should really work that way. And sometimes, much as people like me may hate it, it's a lot easier for the public to take a view on a point if they can see that point in the flesh rather than just hear about it in the abstract. So maybe in the end, that is the real value of publishing some details about politicians' taxes.
Excellent. Dan, thank you so much. Lovely to chat to you as ever. I'm sure we'll have you back again soon. But for now, thank you very much. And that's it from us on The Rest is Money. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Dan. See you soon. Goodbye.